I want to begin today with something that William Sloane Coffin wrote in another part of the essay that we just read. It's actually part of his conclusion. He writes that if we reunite freedom and virtue by caring ceaselessly for one another, affirming both differentiation and communion, then our democracy will once again feel the advance of hope. We have created a world for some of us, he concludes. It's time in the next century, and he wrote this in the 90s, so he means this century, to create one for all of us. It is time to create a world for all of us. Now that seems to me to be an excellent goal for any organization. And certainly it is explicit in the liberal church. It is a call to the liberal church from one of its most famous and prominent leaders. I do wonder, though, how much of this idea of inclusion and diversity that sounds so modern, existed in the ancient world. What sort of goals were in the minds of those former exiles in our reading today from Nehemiah, when they gathered for worship and tried to build up their own fractured society? All the people gathered together into the square, it says, before the water gate. They told the scribe Ezra to bring the book of the law of Moses, which God had given to Israel. Now, this is, as I said before, one of the best descriptions of what worship might have looked like during that time and during the time of the prophets. People gathering, clean and unclean, men, women, children together in one place for the reading and interpretation of the law of Moses. And in a way, worship hasn't changed all that much. I mean, we use a variety of readings today that Ezra would not have been familiar with. Both those from Scripture and the ones we choose to read from other sources and traditions. Poetry, theology, history, and science. But at the same time, we gather here in a group with no regard for age or gender or social rank. And we gather to interpret texts that are in some sense sacred to us. Though in good liberal tradition, we don't always interpret them in the same way. But there is this one difference that I haven't mentioned, and it's probably one you figured out from the title of the sermon. The difference between us and them that may be most obvious is where they do this, is location. In Nehemiah, the congregation is meeting at the water gate. They are outside. They are in public. They are making the connection between faith and the civic life. And they are also reflecting a society in which, at least in terms of religion, there was substantial agreement. We, like most congregations today, meet indoors. Liz McGill's church notwithstanding, of course. And we meet in a special building, set aside for this purpose. We have seats, which aren't the most comfortable seats, but they do have cushions. And we have a riser or a pulpit. We have an organ and a piano. So in some sense, our worship, which happens inside walls, inside a very attractive box, has a private element in addition to its public dimension. Now, of course, there's a reason for this, right? Not the least of which is that it's often cold and rainy where we live. But also, in a pluralistic society like the one we live in, not everyone wants us blocking up the town square to talk about our stuff, our religion. Still, the fact remains, as welcoming as we are, and we are quite welcoming, this simple fact of location and logistics presents a challenge. For someone from outside our community to join us, they must walk through one of two sets of doors, the front and the side. And they must enter into a place that may not at first make all that much sense, even with our low church meeting house style of being together. And it's also true that when Eliot acts in public through service or advocacy, it takes a level of intention and effort that may not have been necessary for Ezra and Nehemiah already on the square. So here we are. We members of the liberal, progressive, forward-thinking church, people who in the course of our days walk in the public square before the Watergate, who act as part of the broad society, who expect their faith and their faith community to do the same, and yet who naturally struggle sometimes. We naturally struggle to find a way and a reason to look outside these beautiful windows, to work, to find an approach to serious issues of our society that is in many ways in a state of crisis today. And we do this in a world, a glorious, fascinating world, where, to paraphrase Coffin in our reading today, not every basketball team is the Boston Celtics, which is sad, particularly this year. Coffin, in his reading, talks about the tension between differentiation and communion, the pull between individualism and community. And we feel this tension all the time, and not just in church. As families and as individuals, we are drawn in many directions. Our days are carefully scripted and scheduled events that try to balance our needs with the needs of those who are dependent on us. We go out of the house after breakfast and return for dinner, and then we go out again, many of us, to meetings and conferences, and yes, if we're lucky, from time to time, to parties and concerts and plays. And as we go through these motions, for many people, questions arise, often unbidden, from the backs of our minds. Questions like, are we doing enough? And who am I doing these things for? Are we doing enough for our families, our friends, for our jobs in some cases, and for our community? And who are those people in that community anyway? What is life like for all those folks who we breeze by on our way to the next thing? And when one spends some time with church leaders for a while, one realizes that we too, ask the same questions of our congregation. Just as politicians and public servants and volunteers for the various organizations that keep our community going, just as they ask it for their institutions and of the Commonwealth in general. In a world made up of so many different groups, and frankly, so many unique and different people, and with the rise of technology that brings us closer together in some ways and farther apart in others, it is hard to know the answer. We do not gather before the Watergate all together anymore. We can't. Sometimes it isn't even clear where the center is. And yet, as human beings, in community, we must move on, in some sense, together. Now, this community, the Eliot Church, of course, is built on the idea that diversity is a good thing. Things like technology may be neutral, but the idea of differentiation in our society and in our own congregation is thought of as good and just and essential for creative and original thought. So we seek out a communion of diversity for ourselves and others. Life just seems more fulfilling and more interesting that way. Kenneth Patton, who we quote here often, claimed that our houses of worship stand for the full and undivided conflict of opinion. And he meant that as a compliment. He actually meant it as a goal. Our solution to no longer standing in the center of the square like Ezra had has traditionally been to bring that town square into the building with us. To reflect, plan, and act alone and together with others who are doing the same thing. For us, the church is not a place separated from the reality of life, but instead it is the place where we come to grapple with these very realities. We are not retreating from the world in our sanctuary, but instead we are working to be informed by it, to be in conversation with it, and at times to argue and to struggle with it, and sometimes against it. Certainly our service programs create windows to the world. They are ways to reach out to others, the branches that Coffin mentions along with those roots. But the forums after church and the Philosophers Club help us to look deeply into current events too. And finally, so does worship. Just as it did for Ezra and Nehemiah, so does worship. Just as it did in the time of Jesus, and just as it did in the time of William Sloane Coffin and Martin Luther King. The fact is that we gather here seeking not just reflection, but relevance. And we come finding not just insight, but the means and the inspiration to act. Let's take a moment now in silence to think on these things.